We need more people to have the courage to stand up to this mob, we have a soft cultural revolution going on in the United States and the West in general. We need people to stand up to this cultural revolution and just demand that, that speak back to these new Red Guards.
Just how did a self-professed communist become one of the most vocal critics of social justice, identity politics, and postmodernism? This is American Thought Leaders, and I'm Jan Jekielek. Today we sit down with Dr. Michael Rectenwald, a former professor at New York University and the author of The Google Archipelago, The Digital Gulag, and the Simulation of Freedom. This book actually shook me to my core. We discuss Dr. Rectenwald's vision of how big tech, influenced by Marxist and postmodernist thought, increasingly enables a toxic mix of censorship, surveillance, social engineering, and social justice policies that in effect create a digital equivalent of the Soviet Gulag. Dr. Michael Rectenwald, really great to have you on American Thought Leaders.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
So you're the author of an absolutely fascinating book, The Google Archipelago. Wow, that's of course alluding to the Gulag Archipelago,
right.
The seminal tome of the 20th century, or one of them
right.
Certainly. Tell me a little bit about this. What is the Google Archipelago?
That's a great question. Okay, so we know what the Gulag Archipelago was, which was a series of prison camps in the Soviet Union. And it was called an archipelago because they were like islands of prison camps that were all connected by virtue of the fact that they were doing the same thing in effect. And Alexander Solzhenitsyn actually spent several years in one, I think 7, 8 years,
right,
in one of the camps. They were penal camps for political dissidents mostly, and they were forced labor camps as well. So interestingly, Marxism, which was supposedly established to stamp out exploitation, instituted slave labor. So the Google Archipelago is not as carceral or corporal as the Gulag Archipelago was. I'm not suggesting that it's as horrible or horrific in its punitive capacities. What I'm saying is that it's establishing a kind of digital gulagging in which we're being surveilled upon, our opinions are being monitored, and dissidents are being disappeared just as they were during the Soviet Union. They're being digitally erased or deleted. I'm talking about Google is merely an emblem for the entire big digital archipelago, if you will, which includes all the big digital corporations like Apple, Google, of course, is Alphabet, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and the whole panoply of social media outlets as well. So the islands are all each corporate entities within the archipelago.
So very interesting. And so you were actually a professor for a number of years at NYU of literary studies.
Right.
This seems to be quite a different topic area.
Yeah.
Can you tell me a little bit about how you came to write something in this realm?
First of all, when I taught writing at NYU, I taught as one of my topic areas the digital realm, the digital world and digital media, in effect.
Yeah.
So I'm not, I was very familiar with the research around it, and I had a whole chapter in a book that I wrote called "Living in a Digital Age and Learning in a Digital World."
Okay.
Era. So, but the reason I wrote the book was that I noticed, in effect, the same ideological propensities that were dominating academia, which actually led to my leaving it, were also apparent and completely saturating the cyber world as well.
Fascinating. So tell me about that. So what is it that you saw in academia that then you realized?
Well, there's this exclusive domination of a particular ideological leftism, which is called social justice. It's a misnomer, if you ask me. But it's a very rigid creed of identity politics and a kind of adherence to a sort of inverse hierarchy in order to debunk the so-called oppressors from the top and put them on the bottom. It is, they instituted at NYU and universities all across the country, 230 universities at least, have instituted what they call bias reporting hotlines,
Okay.
in which students are encouraged to report the bias infractions of their professors or fellow students. So very much like communist Soviet Union and communist China, this kind of ideological policing that was going
Right.
on, and that I found very disturbing, and everybody was going along for the ride. The no platforming of speakers, the way that the left shut down any ideological diversity from appearing on campus at all, burning campuses down, like in Berkeley, when speakers were invited that they didn't approve of.
Right.
And then, of course, other things like trigger warnings on syllabi, which were really, it's a slippery slope toward ideological conformity, and also what safe spaces and things like that.
So just to clarify, the trigger warnings on syllabus, so someone would say, I don't feel comfortable with what's in this syllabus.
Right.
And then that means that you can't teach it
Well,
anymore.
it starts to, you have to start giving alerts as to, you know, when there's something supposedly disturbing in a text on the syllabus, you're supposed to start giving alerts, and then it leads to effectively banishing books. For example, Dante's Inferno has been stricken from curricula because it has a depiction of Muhammad in one of the circles of hell.
I see.
And this is one of the greatest books and one of the greatest poems in the Western canon. And it's a shame that the Western canon is being eradicated. For example, at the University of Penn, they took down from the portal the picture of Shakespeare because he's a white male. So this is happening throughout, and SOAS and University in London struck all white philosophers from the philosophy curriculum.
Wow.
Yes.
So you had something to say about this.
Yes. I thought it was censorship. I thought it was ideological conformity being forced on professors and students. I thought it was a narrow banding intellectually, a narrow banding of our intellectual capacities, and as kind of in a kind of indoctrination of students, rather than teaching, rather than exposing students to diverse perspectives. It was trammeling them and funneling them into a particular perspective, and that really disturbed me.
Fascinating. And so how did the faculty respond to your complaints?
Well, I did an interview for a reporter for the Washington Square News, which was the student newspaper at NYU.
Right.
Within 2 days of this interview appearing in the paper, online and in their print edition, I was denounced by a committee calling themselves the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Group, which I've since dubbed the Conformity, Inequity, and Exclusion Group.
Okay.
Because they demand ideological conformity. They exclude anyone who doesn't, they attempt to exclude anyone who doesn't conform. And you're certainly not considered a peer if you have views that differ from theirs. And then I was put on a paid leave of absence as well. So I was basically banished from the university for a semester and punished with this ideological condemnation in the newspaper by an official committee of the university.
So this is, you were basically an early recipient of cancel culture and
Very
action.
much so. Yeah, before cancel culture existed, I was a victim of cancel culture.
Fascinating. So, okay, I'm getting a picture of this,
Yeah.
and now having looked at your book, I see a pretty strong connection.
Right.
So, what was the next step here for you?
To get into writing this book?
Yeah.
Well, I noticed a few things while I was going through these struggles with the social justice left in the university. I was also noticing, a lot of the unpersoning that was going on,
Okay.
the kind of bias that was obvious in Facebook and Twitter, the shadow banning and banning of anybody that's to the right of Stalin.
Okay.
And that irony should be pretty apparent. And I noticed also the Google search engine was really tilted to the left, and that, and then, for example, James Damore was fired from Google. He was going through the sort of struggle with the social justice warriors inside of Google at the same time that I was battling them at NYU.
I see.
And he was fired summarily for suggesting, with research, documentation, and backing, that there was a difference between the genders and that there were two genders, and that might have something to do with their proclivities for technology. And for that, he was summarily dismissed. So I started seeing that inside of Google and other big digital corporations, this kind of same authoritarian leftism that was running the university system.
Okay.
And then some funny things happened. I was scolded by Siri twice for profanity, and I thought this was all going on while I'm being scolded by these.
But you were telling Siri
No, I didn't even say anything. Out of the blue, Siri spoke through my car speakers and said, "Michael, watch your language." And I mean, I'm serious. This did happen. I have a witness.
Okay.
And I thought, wow, I'm not only being controlled by social justice warriors in the university, but like PC scolds in tech robots. AI bots were now also undertaking sort of like the same sort of censoring.
I see.
And then I went deeply into it, and I started seeing that all these virtual assistants are biased. Google is biased, Facebook is biased. There's evidence galore to support this. And then Project Veritas did an expose while I was writing the book. It's verified everything that I was saying.
Right.
So, yeah, there's the strong connection, and the connection is the ideological sameness, and this ideological conformity demanded in the digital sphere, the same ideological conformity that's demanded in the university.
So Michael, you mentioned something in the book which I think is very interesting, and it's that I don't hear it talked about all that much, but I think very important given a kind of polarized society that's emerging with different ideological viewpoints. And you mentioned how, when you're kind of immersed in a particular ideology, very often you're just simply not aware that it's ideological. You just take it for granted.
Right.
And I think this also explains some of what someone like Scott Adams talks about when he talks about two different people looking at the world on two different screens. The same events are happening, but they're seeing something completely different.
Right.
Can you speak to that a little bit?
Sure. Actually, this is an idea that I adopt from a Marxist theorist, Louis Althusser, who was a French structuralist Marxist, who suggested that when someone is in ideology, they're unaware that they are in ideology, and when they think they're not in ideology, they are in it. Okay? But when you know you're in ideology, that is the moment you have escaped it. So what I'm arguing is that the leftists can't see the ideology in their midst because they're in it, and they don't know that they're in it. And so once you have a recognition of your own ideology, you're able to see it as such.
Fascinating. Is that because it's become kind of the dominant ideology?
It's invisible. The dominant ideology is always invisible, especially to those who hold it. That's how it works. That's how ideology is actually functional.
And so obviously there was some kind of historical inversion.
That's right. Somehow the leftist ideology has become dominant. And that's a very provocative claim that I make in the book and elsewhere. But yeah, I think leftist ideology is the dominant ideology, and it's also the ideology that's supported by big digital.
Right. Listen, I have to tell you, reading this book, Google Archipelago, really kind of shocked me to the core. It caused me to make some connections that I hadn't really seen before. And I've made a study of communism, and especially communist China in particular over the years. My parents escaped from communist Poland in the 70s. I grew up in a free country.
Yeah.
Right? It's very difficult for someone that grows up in freedom to understand what it's like to grow up in a communist society or live in one.
Right.
Because we couldn't even really have this conversation as we're having, or an honest one, because I might know that you're gonna likely tell someone about our conversation or be required to, or be forced to at another time. And similarly, you would have the same idea of me.
Or I might be a spy.
Or you might be a spy. There's basically, it's a society where you might be under surveillance in some capacity at any time, and you adjust your behavior accordingly. If you can imagine what that would look like. What dawned on me for the first time reading your book was, wait a second, through sensors everywhere, through this modern technology, right? Essentially, we're kind of setting up the same situation within a free society.
Right.
And that was the thing that shocked me. So there you go. That's my part of you interviewing me here a bit.
Okay.
But this is, I guess, obvious to you. This was not obvious to me. And even though separately I've seen both of those things.
Yeah.
So this is a central part of basically what you call the Google Archipelago.
That's right. And I was looking at the smart cities in China, right? There are at least 50 smart cities now in China. And that is these cities that have CCTVs, they have all kinds of digital inputs, they're tracking your phones, all these digital inputs, cameras everywhere, LED lights, all over the place.
Right.
That are basically digitizing every move you make.
Yes.
And then that's being fed into databases, and then it's filtered out into the proper agencies depending on what the information is, right?
Right.
Well, I thought, this sounds like it's strictly, the case for China, but then I noticed that this kind of technology is being adopted in the West as well. Darwin, Australia adopted a smart city technology from China.
Yes.
And they're instituting the same exact surveillance system for their safety.
Right.
And then their Sidewalk Labs is another, Google is a partner of Google's.
Okay.
And they're doing the same thing in Toronto. So the West is adopting the very technologies and the very kinds of surveillance systems that are operative in China.
Especially in Xinjiang province, where these systems are what enable
that was the first
very tight control of society,
right?
Total monitoring of these concentration camps.
Yes, they have digital fences.
Yeah.
Where if a certain citizen goes beyond the perimeter, this sends an alert.
Based on their cell phone.
Based on their cell phone or based on a camera input. Basically, I think everybody's going to have a digital signature, whether it's the retina or something else, that will be able to track everyone's movement, and that'll be part of their digital signature, and will also be connected to a digital database that is connected to each person that'll basically include almost all their behaviors.
So, this is something that, let's say, for here, except perhaps Darwin, is something that's in the future, but a lot of these elements from the reading of the Gulag Archipelago are already in place.
Yeah, they are in place.
Right? And in terms of just this kind of, you're being studied on social media, not just by your peers, and there's a kind of ideology that you're supposed to accept.
Exactly.
This is the kind of thing you're talking about, right?
Yes, that's right. And one of the things I want to make clear is that the big digital is not some neutral, politically neutral set of principles or companies. Big digital consists of a bunch of left-leaning authoritarians, and they're so they have the same ideological character in a softer sense, of course, as the CCP.
Okay, so that's a big thing to say. You're gonna have to offer some pretty solid evidence here.
Okay, well, I mean, there's a ton of evidence that shows that Google stacks their search results in a left-leaning way.
Right.
This has been shown by Epstein, and it's also all over the place. It was exposed by Project Veritas, right? Okay, so I believe that Google has a worldview that's reflected both in their algorithms, their outward-facing algorithms, and their internal policies. Their internal policies show that they favor almost all kinds of leftist views, leftist views about identity. They're very, very strong in encouraging transgenderism. They're very strong in discouraging anything like traditional ideas about gender. They also have extremely left-leaning views about the political economy. They have monopolistic ambitions, I think, and they also have state functions. They are, first of all, Google was started by funding from the CIA. And that's not to prove that they have a state function, but they also they continue to cooperate with the state. Now, Project Dragonfly was a fledgling operation that they started to establish in China. They finally caved into the idea that they would offer a search engine that did the kind of censoring and reporting that China wanted. They only stopped this by virtue of the fact that they got busted doing it. I mean, they got caught and it became exposed on the Senate floor. And it all became public information that Project Dragonfly was a search engine they were developing for China, in which when somebody searched for something that was verboten, that the state didn't like, that search would be sent to the state. And so they were self-reporting through Google's apparatus.
Right.
So Google they're birds of a feather with leftist authoritarianism. They're not distinct in any sense other than they're softer in their approach.
Oh, fascinating. I want to catch on a particular point you just mentioned, this idea of these companies almost taking on a state-type character.
Yes.
So you mentioned something in the book described as a private governmentality, if I recall correctly.
Right.
And that's something that's I think probably a pretty difficult concept for a lot of folks to understand, because we separate those things.
Right.
There's a sharp demarcation.
Right.
What does that mean, and how does it apply to big tech?
Yes, governmentality is a term actually coined by the postmodern theorist Michel Foucault. Mm-hmm. So I borrow from the postmodern theoretical toolkit and turn the criticism back against the left. But a governmentality is a function of governmental regulation and control that's not strictly the government itself.
Okay.
Okay. I'm suggesting that Google and other principles of big digital are governmental governmental apparatuses. And that is, they augment the power of the state, and they magnify it, and they extend it, and they feed it. They feed state power. Well, for example, I wrote this before this announcement of HARPA was made.
Okay.
The HARPA is the Health Advanced Research Project agency that is under consideration for being established right now. HARPA would institute, as part of their program, a reporting system that's very close to the social credit score system in China, that would be gathering data using home appliances and the virtual assistants like Alexa, Echo, Google Home, and the Apple Watch. Reporting, by virtue of recording conversations inside of homes, sending this data to centralized databases and deciding whether somebody might own a gun on the basis of of this data that's collected in the home. This is all verifiable. Just Google HARPA, or some other search engine use it. But, hopefully they will stack it in a way that you can actually get this information, but it's out there. HARPA is the beginning of the way of intervening and setting up the kind of social scoring, credit scoring that's going on. And this is not just social credit scoring. This will be a socio-political credit scoring. And that is to say, just like the Chinese Communist Party, their social credit score is tied to the political predilections of the persons involved, right? So it will be here. And given that Google and these other big digital corporations are verifiably leftist in orientation, they will be discriminating against what they deem to be right-wing persons, just as they are right now.
Because that's just not the correct...
It's not politically correct. Let me just give you an example of the political correctness of Google. They have a thing they call algorithmic unfairness. Mm-hmm. Now, algorithmic unfairness sounds like the algorithms are unfair, but what they're trying to suggest is the world is unfair as it is, and their algorithms aim to correct this through machine learning. machine learning fairness, they called it.
Yes.
So that the results they give you are the way they should be in the world rather than the way they are. For example, you wanted to search for American CEOs.
Right.
They will give you a list of CEOs that is tilted towards more women than actually in the population of CEOs. So to make it appear that there are more women as CEOs than there are representatively, percentage-wise.
Right.
So this is the way they say, they even admit this in their documentation. This was exposed by Project Veritas, that they correct for unfairness in the world in a way. It's kind of like a politically correct affirmative action search result, that they're looking for.
Yeah. We've actually, so we've interviewed, one of the Google whistleblowers, Zach Voorhees, on the show, and also Dr. Epstein.
Yeah.
So big tech, or these, social media giants, effectively, they were supposed to be the public square,
That's
so
right.
to speak.
That's
right.
correct.
And I think you argue in the book that by taking control of discourse and enforcing the types of things that you just described, for example, through machine learning fairness, they're actually kind of eroding the existence of the public square, because it's actually increasingly a digital place.
That's right. The public square outside of the digital realm has become largely irrelevant by virtue of the fact that everything's happening in the digital square, in cyberspace.
Right.
And that is okay if it weren't for the fact that at the same time there is this complete discrimination going on in terms of political orientation. Which is demonstrated. It's been demonstrably shown through all these exposés and a lot of studies, right. Epstein studies, other studies. There's plenty of them to show this. So they're in violation of the 1996 Telecommunications Act, Section 230 of that act.
Right.
Because that act suggested that they would be exempt from liability for the statements made by the users
right.
on their platform.
Because they're not taking an editorial role.
Right, they're not editors, or they're not strictly publishers per se. Yeah. So they were exempt from what publishers might face, liability for what they say in their publications.
Right.
In exchange for political neutrality. That was the deal. So they're in violation of that Communications Decency Act, which was 230 of the Telecommunications Act of 1996. And so there's legislation that's being offered up to address that, to redress that issue, to make them adhere to that standard, so that they will then no longer be discriminatory in this. For example, there should be non-discrimination about information that should not be discriminatory in terms of its delivery. And so they're not non-discriminatory. They're not neutral. They are politically biased to an extreme. And so this is one thing that can be done to try to address it.
Right, and you also, you make that case convincingly, I think, in the book in some detail.
Yeah.
Now, how does media, actual media, right, that are doing the editorial work, fit into all this?
Well, there's been a tremendous consolidation, of course, of media over the last 20 years. There's been all kinds of mergers and acquisitions that have reduced the ideological, or just the possibility of more viewpoints. So we've had ideological sameness perpetrated through the media, as the Epoch Times knows. That the New York Times, the Washington Post, most of the major networks are all left-leaning. And they're all biased, and their reporting is almost editorial at this point. Their news can't be considered. It can't be considered journalism. In effect, it can be considered op-ed, but for the most part, it's all been tilted. So they are basically in the same ideological camp as the digital giants are.
It's very interesting.
And the digital giants sort the news based on their ideological conformity. because they're now the delivery mechanism for most of this, as you know.
Well, so that basically, you're saying that, it's almost like if you want to be successful in the social media sphere now, you have to kind of, and you're a media, even if you didn't want to,
you have to conform to the digital giants' proclivities ideologically.
To get all the benefits.
To get noticed in their search results and things, and also to be let through. For example, Facebook bars certain sources from their platforms entirely.
So you describe Russiagate as a first of a particular type of phenomenon, and I'd like you to kind of explore that, because I thought that was a fascinating perspective.
Yes, it's the first in the sense that it's a kind of collaboration between big digital, the intelligence community, and basically what is being referred to as like the deep state, in effect. This was the first ever collaboration in which big digital colluded with the mass media and also the intelligence agencies to provide a certain narrative and to ban other narratives from being disseminated as broadly. And the interesting thing about this is that one of the main companies that was deemed an anti-disinformation agent that exposed Russiagate, supposedly, is called newknowledge.com.
Right.
There was never a greater misnomer than this company's name, because they are new nescience, that is non-knowledge. They are the opposite of knowledge. They are creating fabrications. They were one of the main reporters to the U.S. Intelligence Committee about Russiagate, about the Russian bots that had supposedly influenced the 2016 election. In the 2017 senatorial election of Roy Moore, where Roy Moore ran for Alabama senator, they produced Russian bots. They created Russian bots to support Roy Moore's candidacy, to disqualify him because he was supported by the Kremlin, supposedly. And then they dished that news out to the newspapers and to the media outlets, saying this is happening. There's Russian bots are supporting Roy Moore, Russian bots which they created. And this is supposedly the biggest disinformation agency, anti-disinformation agency in the internet, on the internet. And that's how they bill themselves.
So black is white.
Everything is inverted. And this is Orwellian. This is Orwellian. Truth is falsity and falsity is true. And so they got exposed by the New York Times and the Washington Post. An unbelievable breakthrough journalistically. I mean, because you would think that they would not cover this because it is actually Democratic, they're Democratic organs, Democratic Party organs, those two papers. I mean, that's pretty clear. But they did cover this. And then Twitter knows about this, and they didn't throw them off Twitter. They still have a Twitter account. The owner of the company, the major funder of this company, also has a Twitter account. And then when a Trump supporter said that in the 2020 election he was going to create assets on Facebook and elsewhere to support Trump, false assets, he hadn't done it yet, but he was banned from Twitter. Just by virtue of telecasting what he was going to do.
Right, just his intentions
as opposed to actual actions. As opposed to actually doing it. So it just shows you the disparity, the double standard is extreme. One does it, the other says they're going to do it. The one who does it doesn't get thrown off the social media platform. The one that hasn't done it yet is thrown off by virtue of the fact that they're supporting a right wing, Trump.
So you're talking a lot about the left, and I think in a way that clearly shows me you don't see yourself as part of the left.
No, not at all.
But at one point you were.
I was a
right?
leftist. Yes, yeah. I was a left communist, left of the Bolsheviks.
Okay, I don't even know what that means. But so how did that change? Is this that same process?
Just by virtue of by the same process. When the left turned on me and drove me out, I saw their totalitarian impulses under the surface of this egalitarian rhetoric and everything that the veneer that they cover all their philosophies under. And I just saw that, and I just saw the true face of this. And then I started doing historical research. I read the Black Book of Communism.
Okay.
And I learned
I wish more people read the Black Book of Communism.
Right. It's just incredible, right?
Yeah.
And it shows you that, the most pernicious political ideology of the 20th century was not Nazism, it was actually communism, in terms of sheer numbers.
Right.
They killed 94 million people, counting China and the Soviet Union and other, Cambodia and so forth.
Right. Well, just as an aside, I was reading, we had an article in the Epoch Times recently about how in the European Parliament there was a motion, I believe, that was passed that put communism in the same realm of, egregious ideology as Nazism, National Socialism. And it was described as a massive breakthrough because it's very curious that everyone is really, really clear on how horrible National Socialism is.
Right.
Or
And
was.
It was.
Was. And of course
dreadful.
it was, but there seems to be a much smaller group of people
Much smaller, and
that are aware.
This is very, very much connected to academia. When I started doing research on the criminality of the political left, I found a lot of things that were buried under carpets or disappeared.
Okay.
I mean, I couldn't find in academic scholarship the histories. They're just eradicated. It's incredible. I actually had to rely on non-academic sources to find the facts.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
So there's been this kind of, well, I've heard about, for China, the People's Republic of Amnesia.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
The inconvenient realities
Right.
are kind of
Disappeared.
Yeah, are disappeared or removed.
That's happening in U.S. scholarship, and the left-leaning character of academia is so profound that they have disappeared the criminality of the political left from all education. I mean, that's huge. So you don't learn about the crimes of the Soviet Union or China. You don't learn about this in the U.S. educational system for the most part. It's disappeared.
Fascinating, and deeply disturbing. So as I said, your book shocked me to the core, and one of the reasons it did was with this kind of pervasive rise of big tech.
Yeah.
In kind of injecting itself into literally every aspect of life and thought even and so forth. And that's only accelerating. I mean, this is just the beginning, right?
Right.
On this kind of curve, right?
Right.
That could make one feel quite despondent.
Could.
About the future.
Right.
Yeah. What are your thoughts? What is what?
I have
what
a great
can be
deal
done?
of faith in people's intelligence to see through ideology, because I was able to do so myself. If I can see it, other people can see it, and I know other people who do see it. And I think that big digital is going to be constructing very powerful narratives, and we have to posit counter narratives that are truth-based.
Okay, truth.
Truth.
So truth has been a casualty in all of this, right?
It's been a casualty of the postmodern academy and the postmodern intellectual realm for the last 50 years. You can't use the word truth in the university. You're trained very early on not to even talk about that. There's no such thing. Because everything is, postmodernism, everything is local. Truths are only contingent upon the identity of the person who holds the
Right.
view. Everybody's got their own truth. There's no universal truth. There's nothing that can be established as objective. Objectivity is, in fact, a masculinist, white supremacist notion, all that, right?
Right.
So that has been a major casualty in the last 50 years of intellectual life, and it's pervaded the entire culture so that we have a post-truth culture, right?
But yet people seek it. I mean, that's what you're kind of arguing. You think
Yes.
people are going to see through this, or
People
starting
have to
or-
start to believe that in truth again. And they have to start establishing a new metaphysics of truth, is what I argue in the book. And that is going to be more and more necessary as basically big digital sets up a simulation of reality, which they're very capable of doing. and such that, and then reporting on that as the reality, right? And we see that going on right now in the political sphere.
So essentially, but you argue that this whole Russiagate is pretty much that. It's a simulation,
it's a simulation.
A very engrossing and pervasive simulation.
It's a simulated reality that becomes the dominant narrative, and that basically supplants truth, and basically preempts its discovery and its enunciation.
Right. Yeah, and we're just, I just had an interview earlier today talking about the newest developments, newest iterations of it.
Yes.
Given that the education system is so saturated
yes.
with this, the post-truth
mm-hmm.
education, post-truth reality,
yeah.
how is it that we can get back to?
Well, we have to have a tremendous amount of public intellectual criticism of the academy. It has to continue, and people have to defect like I've done. I'm basically a defector, right?
Well, that's very interesting, but I suppose you're right.
Yeah, I'm a dissident. I'm a dissident, a defector from the academic union of ideological conformity, and we need more of that. We need many more. There are not many in the United States. There's several Canadian professors.
Yes.
Who have become dissident, and I'm friends with all of them. Jordan Peterson, Gad Saad, and a whole slew of others, Philip Saltzman, and other
right.
Dissident intellectuals that are, speaking out against all this. But we need more. We need more people to have the courage to stand up to this mob, this kind of. We have a soft cultural revolution going on in the United States, and the West in general. We need people to stand up to this cultural revolution and just demand that, that speak back to these new Red Guards.
Well, and that's very interesting because, of course, if you stood up to the Red Guards in China during the Cultural Revolution, you would be dead. Whereas here, you can be canceled, but you can still find friends, and there's people. I've met an incredible number of people in the most unexpected places.
Right.
Talking about the sorts of things you're talking about.
Just like there are the islands of the archipelago, of the Google Archipelago, there are islands like Epoch Times of intellectual and truth-based reporting and discovery that exist, and we have to build on that.
Wonderful. Well, such a pleasure to have you here, Michael.
My pleasure. Thank you.